Hi y'all, welcome back to Sentro School. Today we'll be learning all about waste yarn, what it is, why it's important, and how to use it. So let's get started. First up, what is waste yarn? Waste yarn is yarn that you'll use at the beginning and end of each of your panels or tubes that you make on your Sentro, and that you'll end up removing from your project. This yarn will usually be something cheap that works well in the machine and is a different color than your main project yarn. I typically use cheap acrylic or polyester yarn for this because it's going to get used a lot and you're never going to want to use it in a finished piece, so eventually you're probably just going to throw it out. So why is waste yarn important? First, you'll end up with much nicer top and bottom edges on your projects if you use waste yarn than if you just do a typical cast on and cast off with your main project yarn. Second, waste yarn can help so much when you're joining panels or tubes together. The waste yarn makes it so much easier to see all of the stitches in your first and last rows on your main project, so you are much less likely to forget to secure a stitch. This next point is in a similar vein as the previous point, but if you want to add a border of some kind to either end of your project, then doing that with waste yarn on your project again is going to make it so much easier, and you'll be so much less likely to pass over a stitch without securing it. Next, waste yarn makes it much easier to count your rows while your project is still on the machine. If you're a more advanced Sentro user or you're also a hand knitter, then this probably isn't that big of a deal, but for all you beginners out there, this can be very helpful. And finally, waste yarn makes it much easier to create ribbing on your project. If you accidentally pull apart too many stitches while creating your ribbing, it's really no big deal because you have this extra leeway with the waste yarn. You can just fix the waste yarn and continue making your ribbing with no worries. Okay, so how do you use waste yarn? To use waste yarn, just cast onto your machine like normal for however many stitches you need, then bring your yarn through the yarn intention guides. Knit a few rows with your waste yarn, and then you'll switch to your main project yarn. To do that, take your waste yarn out of the guides and put the tail in the middle of your machine. Then put a tail of your main project yarn in the center of your machine and bring it through the guides, and you're ready to knit with your main project yarn. Once you're done with your main project, take the yarn out of the guides, put it in the middle of your machine, and switch back to some more waste yarn. Just like before, we'll put a tail in the center of the machine and then put the waste yarn through the guides, and we're ready to knit. So knit a few rows with your waste yarn and then cast off. Now your project is ready for whatever your next steps are, whether that be securing the stitches on your main project, adding a border, seaming pieces together, or whatever else you can think of. I already covered how to do a crochet bind off in a previous video, but I did want to briefly go over this one possible way of securing your stitches so that you can remove your waste yarn. So as you can see here on the back side of my swatch, the final row of my main project is very visible, which is exactly why it's so nice to use waste yarn. So to secure these stitches, just take a large crochet hook and insert it into the first stitch on the side of your project with the long tail. Then just chain one and make a slip stitch in every single stitch of this row, making sure you don't skip any stitches, otherwise when you remove your waste yarn, that column will unravel. Luckily with the waste yarn here, it's super easy to see every single stitch, so you're unlikely to skip one. Then once you've secured all of your stitches, you can remove the waste yarn. You'll just pull out the strand of yarn that's holding the final row of stitches from your waste yarn in place, and then just continue pulling the yarn tail until it all unravels, and there you go. Now you should have a nice clean looking edge along your project and the waste yarn is gone. The last thing I want y'all to keep in mind is that waste yarn is not necessary for every project, and if you're a more advanced user, you'll probably find yourself using waste yarn less and less, but it is still a very important tool to understand and utilize when you need to. So if you have any more questions about waste yarn, please leave them in the comments and I will try to answer them for you. So that's all for this video. I hope you found it helpful. If you did, then be sure to leave a like, and if you enjoy Sentro content, then be sure to subscribe. I hope you'll have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you next time. Bye!